Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast. We're here for episode 8 of the casual stream. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to check out my locals where you can support the channel directly. For those who already support, thank you for that support. Continued support keeps this channel going. For those who do support, you can also make recommendations for future episodes and interact directly with the channel. Again, as well, at the end of the episode today, I'll look at the chats, and for super chats, we'll get first billet, and then the rest will be looked at as a case by case basis. Now, as a sort of for today's episode, I want to thank J Marshall J, a subscriber from my locals, who recommended this particular episode topic. This topic about arms control. And while we'll introduce what he has to say while we wait for more people to tune in. Hello, Youth in Asia. I see that you're here already. So he says, we have the problem of what is euphemized as collateral damage in places like Israel, Afghanistan, or the Ukraine, and the squabbles are over whether or not it's legitimate. Chemical warfare is banned, so why not try banning artillery and cruise missiles or even gunpowder altogether? Perhaps for many reasons unfeasible, but does this mean that typically cherry-picking do-gooders have to admit they really do not care so much about the civilians? Well, I mean, there's kind of a lot here as far as, regulation and the cost of regulation and how difficult or easy it might be. And then the other question is, well, even if it's feasible to do it, ought one to do it, right? So I think with, say, what's classically called NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, I think it certainly for domestic ownership, the right to the justification for banning civilian access or non-governmental access is sort of fairly self-evident, right? So unlike, say, a bullet or even an artillery shell, which yes can miss the target, there's no obvious area of effect damage, but like not in the sense of if you have a poison gas leak, it just kind of goes everywhere and it targets everyone indiscriminately. The same would go for nuclear radiation or a biological attack. And so the issue then is, well, these are what I would say, we can make a distinction between indiscriminate weapons, discriminate weapons, and precise weapons. So what do I mean by that? An indiscriminate weapon would be anything that's NBC, at least, because there's no feasible way to limit the damage and death from within the radius of its use. And also, those tend to be weapons of terror anyhow. They're tended to be used against civilian populations by intent. Whereas, chemical weapons were used on the battlefield in World War I. But then Saddam, of course, famously used them against the Kurds, civilian centers, as well as Tehran as well in the Iran-Iraq War. But the other thing is then we have, we had weapons that are not precise, right? They're discriminatory. So artillery, dumb rounds, guns, dumb rounds, they still might miss the mark. Like, let's say you fire a lot of artillery shells and you wear the barrel out, so there's barrel bend. And then maybe you missed the mark, not intentionally, but your calculations didn't take into account the barrel warp or something. Yes, but it's still discriminate, right? There's a way that you can use it to target military personnel with a reasonable amount of certainty that you don't target civilians or people that weren't in the line of fire. So, for example, in the Napoleonic Wars and in the American Civil War, artillery was used on the battlefield to target military personnel. Now, you could also point it at cities and shell cities, which was also done at that time. But it wasn't primarily a weapon of terror to attack civilians. And furthermore, these discriminate weapons were also not necessarily intended for that use, so they might be put to that use. And then we have what we might call precise weapons. So we could say, for example, a sniper rifle is a precise weapon. We could say that, these advanced guidance systems with lasers, PGMs, or whether it's laser guided, wire guided, or heat seeking, are precise. And it's not that anything is 100% precise, but if you have a spectrum of munitions on target versus off target, the further down you go to the precise category, the more you have sort of bullets within the target range of the target you're shooting at rather than outside of it. And so I think if a weapon is completely indiscriminate, like NBC, then the justification for regulating it is fairly obvious, because we all know the sort of slipshod way that property holders or landowners keep their property. They don't necessarily, landlords are notorious for this. They don't keep up on the repairs. They don't keep up on all these things, which that's bad enough. But let's say somebody had a leaky poison gas plant. Well, then all of a sudden it kills the whole town, and it's over. So in that sense, this isn't the kind of thing that you can just be like, oh well, we'll just let it go, right? It's one thing if the roof leaks in the rental apartment that the landlord owns. It may be a pain in the neck for the people renting there, but it doesn't necessarily kill everybody in the town. So we can already sort of budget for a level of carelessness that having that would not be allowed for. But then there's the second level, which would be like we might call international regulation. So there seems to be, during the beginning of the war on terror around 2003, when Bush started the Axis of Evil, the sort of justification was to prevent them from getting or further acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Right. So Iraq, Saddam Hussein, I think it was 1981, Israel launched an airstrike on their nuclear reactor, setting back their nuclear program. And then, Saddam had chemical weapons and used them against Iran. But, so we were saying, well, we don't want him to get any more or nuclear weapons. And then Syria didn't have either. And then North Korea at the time did not yet have nuclear weapons either. And so then what is the cost of keeping the nuclear club small? Well, first of all, given that the ability to refine uranium, have sort of a university STEM program that allows the production of nuclear scientists, and then the advanced weapon systems to deliver them, the nuclear weapons, you have to have a fairly high level of capitalization. So a lot of nations are just not going to have access to it. They'll just be outpriced. And then there'll be those that are within the price range that will strive to get it because it gives them protection, right? So, for example, would Saddam Hussein's Iraq have been invaded if it had nuclear weapons? Furthermore, Ukraine had nuclear weapons as of 1993 when they disarmed them. Well, Russia wouldn't be invading right now. So the moral of this, and Gaddafi's Libya gave up nuclear weapons in the 80s, and they got invaded in 2011. So the moral of the story is don't give up your nuclear weapons because you'll get invaded by somebody. But the actual cost, if we look at the cost of the war on terror, it's trillions and trillions of dollars. And so then we say, let's look at the expected cost of Iraq developing NBC weapons platforms versus the actual cost of preventing them from getting it. And, I think a lot of people, especially now, would be like, well, it wasn't worth the cost. And that kind of reasoning of preventing other nations from getting certain, what we might call indiscriminate weapon systems, like say Syria, also had this added cost. And so it would seem that because we know that once you get into the nuclear club, there are rules and systems in place that regulate the use of them already. And officially, we have China, Russia, France, England, and the United States. And I think we can say unofficially Israel and North Korea, also Pakistan and India officially. Iran seems to be getting increasingly close. And so then the question is, well, the cost of one nation, or in this case, a coalition of nations led by the U.S. representing the UN, it's a vastly expensive project. And given the cost alone of preventing Saddam Hussein from getting NBCs, it seems very unfeasible that an international regulatory body could prevent even half a dozen countries from getting NBCs, because the combination of invasion and sanctions would just be catastrophically expensive. So I think the first question is it's just not feasible. And the United States made the mistake of thinking that it was, had it escaped, all the limiting factors that empires before have had. limiting factors of energy resources, information and knowledge, and then the will of both the people at home and the people abroad. And then you could ask the question, well, is it desirable to limit these other nations from getting nuclear weapons? That seems to be a little bit harder because I think ideally we would want a world without nuclear weapons, but they're here to stay for the time being, and it's difficult to see how you could put that genie back in the bottle. And then that then means so. For example, if the United States had been the only nation with nuclear weapons, as it was in 1945, the United States would have used nuclear weapons again because there would have been no cost to using them. But once the Soviet Union got its own nuclear program up and running in 1949-50, there now became a cost to using it again. And then we developed the hydrogen bomb, and then they developed the hydrogen bomb. And so it's really, I think, cost prohibitive to have one nation with an atomic monopoly because it just incentivizes them to use atomic weapons because there's no way to counteract it. So I don't think it's even desirable to, because there's already limiting factors already for nuclear weapon systems. The capitalization you need, the scientists you need, a whole bunch of things have to work out right, which excludes most nations by default. And furthermore, if you look at, say, someone like Iran, for decades now, the United States has portrayed Iran as a rogue nation led by crazy theocrats. Yet, it's not the crazy theocrats in Iran that are starting conflicts in Eastern Europe and the South China Sea. It's the crazy bureaucrats in Washington. So really, who's more of a threat here, right? Iran with nuclear weapons, or, the U.S. political establishment with nuclear weapons? So I think in that case, regulation is not even desirable because if only one nation has the weapons, then they're incentivized to use it, again, as we did in 1945. So barring a way to get rid of them entirely, it doesn't. I think it creates a bad balance to have just one nation or block of nations that are allied together having nuclear weapons. Now we can go to discriminate weapons that, yes, do have area of effect. I mean, a bomb or an artillery shell does blow up. But again, it's controllable in the sense that if you choose not to attack cities and you use artillery just against troops and bombs from airplanes just against troops, as the Germans did in their blitzkrieg of Western Europe, you can effectively choose to leave out the civilian population. That's something that's a lot harder to do if you want to use NBC weapons. It's a lot harder to eliminate catastrophic collateral damage even if you wanted to. But as we saw with the German blitzkrieg on the Western Front, you can effectively leave out the civilian population using these weapons. So then the question is, well, can they be regulated? Well, let's first talk about the U.S. contact, since I think that's in part what J. Marshall J. was getting at. I believe that the correct interpretation of the Second Amendment is that while I think that the NBCs would fall out of whatever rubric the Founding Fathers were thinking of because such weapons didn't really exist and are qualitatively different than what they were regulating, they wanted a citizen body that had pure military equipment, which in the 18th century meant muskets and rifles and cannons. And we know private individuals could own cannons because of privateers in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, which clearly that was within the rubric of the Second Amendment. The actual limiting factors would be capital cost. I mean, you could you theoretically own a tank? Theoretically, but you probably couldn't afford one. Or rather, most people probably couldn't afford one. Maybe you could have some like National Guard or militia that does that. So then the thing is, I think that, those kinds of weapon systems should within the implied meaning of the Second Amendment should not be limited or regulated. So, for example, Madison says in one of the Federalist Papers that literally the whole point was to be able to overthrow a tyrannical government. He makes an appeal to Europe, saying that if the people had their own arms and armament, they could overthrow the heads of Europe, as his underlying theoretical justification for the Second Amendment. Now, of course, once war becomes heavily capitalized, then it's very difficult to have peer weapons technology with the average people. No matter how hard they try, they're not going to be able to pool the resources necessary to get a fleet of B-2 bombers or something, which the U.S. government or any national government could do. So there's that, right? But then you might say, well, okay, but like with artillery and rocket launchers, you still have the risk of some collateral damage. It's one thing if a guy shoots up a school with a pistol or a rifle, but what if it's an RPG? What if it's a howitzer? Yeah, it would certainly make it worse. But I think on the one hand, most of those people who do those things don't have enough resources or connections to actually procure such hardware. And furthermore, they are again discriminate. If you don't point them at civilian population centers, then they're not likely going to have catastrophic collateral damage. So the justification for regulating them, again, I think goes down because on the one hand, many of these are just too expensive for the average person, and those that aren't, such as like a machine gun or an automatic rifle, are within the limits of the Second Amendment. And I think it's also important to ask why regulation often takes place in this way. Well, there was a video that I did a few months ago about the Second Amendment where I go into greater detail as a roundtable discussion. And one of the things that I said there is, if you look at, like, say, the Discourse on Livy by Machiavelli, he states that, a tyrant disarms his people because he fears them. So, like, he mentions the King of France. And in The Prince, the Swiss are the most free because they're the most well-armed. And I also make mention that throughout, Western history, the idea of having the right to bear arms was considered a mark of a free citizen. The U.S. Second Amendment, as a legal precedent or concept, goes back to 1187 with the Assizes of Arms of Henry II, where freeborn Englishmen were expected to provision their own armor and spears to, defend the realm. So it also ties into Aristotle's concept of a righteous, of a just ruler who's a king versus a tyrant. So a king is defended by his own people, so therefore he trusts them and he allows them to have armaments. And a tyrant does not trust his people and hires basically mercenaries and foreigners to fight for him, to hold down his people, and they have no compunction killing his people. So there's that as well. And I think in that case that the cost, this desire to regulate is coming from a false pretense. They put on a pretense when it's really a desire for control. For example, Mexico has far stricter gun control laws than the United States. So does Honduras, but they're like the murder capitals of the New World. I mean, a lot of good arms control did there. Switzerland has some of the highest per capita gun ownership and doesn't have a violent crime rate comparable to the United States. It's all smoke and mirrors, right? It's just in order to roll out a control grid. But then the question is, especially in the United States, but even in a large country, is it possible to regulate firearms? No, it's not, because Mexico can't, right? It just goes underground. And then you have this large black market of cartels trafficking in AK-47s and RPGs. And you see this in other parts of the world as well. And so it becomes very difficult. I mean, I suppose China can do it, but they have totalitarian controls over the country. And again, that just proves my point. In order to maintain those totalitarian controls, they have to disarm the population. So I think ultimately the cost, because ultimately producing a small arm is not really that expensive, all things considered. Whereas the extended bureaucracy and, the boots on the ground that have to be looking at people and tracking them to make sure that they don't have or that you have a weapon system, and then arresting that person and everything, and so on, and regulating the sale of firearms, creates this massive cost. It's far greater than the actual weapon itself. It's sort of like trying to bomb the VC supply lines in the Vietnam War. You might expend a bomb that costs tens of thousands of dollars to kill, a Vietnamese peasant with a wheelbarrow. This is not an economic way to limit supply. It's not economic to limit supply that way. And that seems to be what is going on with these controls that are imposed on small arms. And so I think that that's really not, very difficult to do. The other thing would be then precise weapons. Well, again, except maybe a sniper rifle, most precise weapons are going to be too expensive for the average citizen. I mean, who's going to have a precision-guided munition? I mean, the missiles that are fired by the Javelin are, tens of thousands of dollars per missile. Or an artillery round from an M77 howitzer with, a radar-guided, satellite-guided JDAM bomb or shell is prohibitively expensive. This is really, really expensive. And so, again, a lot of these really high-grade things are just not within the reach of the average citizen. And even if they were, they're now maximizing hits on target. So, the resultant collateral damage, if used, would be very, very low. So I think ultimately most of the big scary weapons are going to be self-regulated because they're just too expensive for most individuals to get. And by extension, preventing other countries from getting them is just prohibitively expensive. Everything I said about NBCs with regards to Iraq and Syria are exponentially more so about weapon systems below that to other countries around the world. It's ultimately an arms race that is increasingly expensive for the regulator to perform, which creates a bad EROI ratio, which eventually leads to its collapse on a sort of thermodynamic level. So it's much easier to create these things in a black market area and then distribute them around the world. And it's always going to be that way. And sometimes even the U.S. government gets involved, like with Fast and Furious in Mexico. So I think overall, regulating weapon systems is increasingly prohibitively expensive, and it's just a pipe dream to try to do that. What's probably more feasible is coming up with a regulatory framework in which they can be used, and then giving nations that enter these clubs, being the threshold of weapon systems, reasons to play by those rules. And then also on a domestic level, other than regulating indiscriminate weapons like NBCs, I think anything else is clearly just an attempt at curtailing the liberty of the citizens. But that's not the only thing you can regulate, right? We can talk about regulating consumable items. Like, for example, in the 1920s, the United States regulated the consumption of alcohol. Also as well, throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, the United States regulated the distribution of sexually explicit materials. So then the question is, what would be the justification for regulating anything, right? Because of course regulations impose costs, but if you could demonstrate that the thing being regulated imposed more costs on the community than the regulation itself, that would be a precondition for demonstrating that the regulation was justifiable. The other thing you could say to justify the regulation is saying that the thing being regulated is in some way prohibiting the society from reaching a higher order existence, maybe a more refined culture or a higher level of technological development or whatever, something. And that by eliminating it from the positive, because what happens is if you give people too many choices, you end up with like a donkey equidistant between two haystacks, and they can't decide what to do. So, which means nothing gets done. They just kind of get analysis paralysis and frozen in place. And so sometimes you can argue that a regulation is necessary because it removes unproductive choices that facilitates the decision-making process to get the country to a further position. I think we can argue now some regulations, of course, failed. Obviously, the regulation of alcohol in the United States was not very successful at all. Other regulations were far more successful. For example, again, the Comstock laws regulating, they in some shape or form were in place for almost 100 years, from 1873 to 1973 with Roe v. Wade. So Roe v. Wade being the last domino to fall from that regulatory framework. And I think if we look at the state of American families, the costs of American sexual dysfunction. So, for example, the cost of divorce court, the cost of antibiotics, the cost of social damage, children growing up in broken homes. All of these costs are just cataclysmically expensive and catastrophic. Arguably, any one of them far more than the actual cost of the regulation of Comstock. Some people might say, well, what about when you have other modes of distribution beyond the post office, like, say, UPS or FedEx? Well, they would just fall under the same rubric. I mean, a lot of these private corporations already do anyhow in other regulatory schemas. And so the question then is, are you regulating? Because it's not regulation versus no regulation, right? All countries have, everybody would agree that a law against murder, a law against theft, a law against rape, a law against all these things would be good. Because if we allow people to do these things unchecked, then it disrupts and collapses the society that you're trying to live in. So of course we would be okay with regulating it. So there's that, but then there's also things that are, quote unquote, partisan issues right now in the United States about whether you should regulate this or regulate that. And I think it's pretty clear that from the position of the right in the United States, looking at the century where we had Comstock in place versus the last 50 years, it's been a complete dumpster fire, a complete disaster on every front. So I would argue the cost of the regulation was more than justified by the externalities that were prevented. And then furthermore, if you look at, say, someone like J.D. Unwin with Sex and Culture, the idea that sublimating sexual desire is a precondition for civilized life in the first place, as his anthropological studies indicate, which itself was predicted by Freud, and civilization is discontent. In fact, that's why Unwin did all of his anthropological studies. He wanted to test that theory. Well, okay, I think, Unwin, I think, has very convincing social science data, and we have our own lived experience in the last 50 years where civilization is just disintegrated into tatters. So I think in that case, it's a pretty open and shut justification for that. Now, for example, though, banning the consumption of alcohol, I think that's probably a bad one. Not only did it not work, it didn't even last a decade, really. Only a little over a decade, like 11, 12 years. It created a whole bunch of terrible externalities with the mafia and organized crime syndicates, which once ensconced just shifted over to other things like prostitution, racketeering, and things like that. So that was another thing that happens from that regulatory framework. So rather than curbing alcoholism, which was the intent, it goes underground and just creates all of these cartels. Whereas that didn't really happen in the century under Comstock or some version of that legal apparatus. And some things are just easier to control than others as well. I mean, obviously, it's a lot harder to control weapons exchanging hands, and alcohol exchanging hands, and certain other things. And so the question is, for the cost of regulation, how can we look at regulation in this way? Can we justify it? Is the cost of it going to be cheaper or lead to better results than letting that thing be on its own? Right, because we can envision a ridiculous scenario where, there's some sort of, we don't use stamps anymore, but you can imagine when stamps were used that the government has an onerous presence in the distribution of stamps. And it's just like there's no real justification for it other than just to flex and to get people under its thumb. It doesn't facilitate anything, and it's just in your way. Sure, that's a thing that can happen, and that's more of a flex by the government. But I think also what you need to factor into is efficiency of organization and technological sophistication, right? So part of the argument against, say, in modern times, against the evangelicals or traditional Christian conservatives for their sort of regulations that they want to have with regards to human sexuality is that we have all these technologies now. How are you going to regulate it? We have the internet, we have Netflix, you can get all sorts of explicit material that way. We have factories, churning out all of these family planning, sexual hygiene products. How do you regulate that? And then, what do you do with all of these things that are there? Because technology, right, is perceived as making this judo throw. That's like, well, now what do you do? Because any attempt to regulate that's going to be tyrannical. Well, on the one hand, something like that was the case ever since the 13 colonies. So nobody who wrote the Constitution thought that was tyrannical on the face of it. And then the question is, we see the government do this all the time on all sorts of other markets, right? As soon as the digital world was developing and became firmly ensconced, the government moved in right away to regulate it. Or when the radio became big in the 20s and 30s, they jumped right in. And people didn't view this as an onerous, totalitarian overreach. They're like, well, of course, it's sensible. And I think a lot of this could be justified in much the same way. As far as limiting smoking, whatever side of the aisle you were on during the 90s and aughts, they were pretty successful in limiting smoking. I used to see people smoking all the time growing up, but I don't see very many now. At least not in public. They might do it in private, like in their own homes or something, but public smoking is way down. So that can be done through the right incentives and pressures. And also in increasing levels of efficiency of organization. So you can lower the cost of doing something by making the organization more efficient, by streamlining it, by having new modes of operation, new SOPs. So the idea then becomes kind of an arm race, right? Because you can say that we can imagine a scenario in which technology and efficiency is on the side of the black market, so to speak, where they want to get around the regulation, and for a while they can. But depending on what that is, especially if it's socially destructive, then it creates a built-in demand to be regulated at some point, and eventually, political forces are able to then leverage the technology themselves to then create a regulatory system over it. So, for example, the printing press in the 16th century, was a boon to dissidents like the Protestants vis-a-vis the Catholic Church, or even like Renaissance humanists vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. But by the time you get to the 20th century with totalitarian regimes, like the Soviet Union, you can effectively control the printing press. It took a while, but you could do it. Now, not that I'm advocating totalitarian censorship over the printing press, but the idea being that you can eventually catch up and then reimpose this system of regulation on top of it all. And so then I guess to the other question this guy had was, does this mean that they don't really care much about civilians? Well, I think that's kind of an open question, because it is extremely difficult to regulate these armaments and systems. And so, well, what do you do if it does lead to civilian casualties? I mean, because one thing that you would have to do is not target urban centers. And the United States has been targeting urban centers since World War II. I think here the real issue is not so much weapon systems. I mean, even a smart bomb will still miss its mark in a city, but you're firing it in a city. That's that's going to kill civilians almost regardless, right? The real issue is, why is it being fired in that situation? Why aren't you firing it on military targets? And so I think the issue here, and it could be insincerity, or it could just be confusion and muddled thinking, is that the real problem here with U.S. collateral damage is that we're firing these weapon systems into urban centers, which are not proper military targets. And the real question we should be asking is not, why are we using smart weapons? Smart weapons are a good deal more precise than anything else, but why are we firing them in urban centers? And that's not really an issue of armaments limitations or restraint. It's an issue of policy. And I think part of the reason why the United States does this, targets urban centers, is it goes back to the fact that the total war theories that were developed even as early as the American Civil War, the idea that you have to make everybody feel the pain of the conflict in order that they're going to rise up and overthrow their government. I mean, you hear rhetoric like this in World War II, and it's completely insane. I mean, if you're bombing German cities, you expect them to rise up and overthrow Hitler? No, it's a godsend. Goebbels and the propaganda ministry were able to use that to fortify support. And as well as the German bombing of, the nationalist bombing of Guernica, in part by the Condor Legion, did galvanize the Republican forces. It didn't break their spirit. And so this idea that attacking urban centers would break the spirit of those who do it is a fundamentally fallacious doctrine. It's never worked. But I think partly we keep believing it in the West, especially in the United States, because we have an independent air arm, right? It used to be the U.S. Army Air Force, which is an adjunct to the military. So air power was initially conceived of as tactical in order to give direct support to troops on the ground, which is what we saw with the German Blitzkrieg in Western Europe. Rather, it's an independent arm for independent strategic operations. And independent strategic operations means attacking infrastructure, which means attacking cities. And so there's this built-in doctrinal issue with U.S. air power that is really the problem, not so much this or that weapon system per se. Because, I mean, even a bomber doesn't have to be used to bomb a city. So, for example, you could just, have missile. You could use, in fact, the B-52 bomber right now is primarily used as a missile boat. And the Russians with their Tupolevs do the same thing. They have a bunch of long-range missiles on their bombers, and they shoot them off at standoff range. they need a bomber to fire them because many of these missiles are so large, only a bomber is large enough to carry them, which is a new role for them to be sure, and one that really I think becomes possible in the 80s. But it's definitely one that could be consistent with a low footprint. Now, if we want to look at that question and say, are those who advocate regulation of small arms in the United States and Western Europe dishonest? Yes, absolutely. A lot of these people are just useful idiots for the power structure. Because, I mean, right, you could totally trust the government with a monopoly on weapons. Totally. I mean, the start of the 20th century doesn't give you any reason to doubt that the government isn't, going to treat this as a sacred trust to never use its monopoly of violence against its own citizen population. I mean, it's a joke. It's a joke. And we also know that regulation doesn't work because Mexico's tried it and it has all these gang wars and cartels all over the place. So, yeah, in that case, I'd say it's blatantly dishonest. And so I guess a third level of regulation might be regulation consumption of energy. We're beginning to see that now in Europe and the United States as we run out of access to energy resources. And, well, okay, there's a lot of things going on here, so I'll try to make this succinct. First of all, we have the price of energy going up. That's in part due to inflation, no doubt. But in Europe, it's due to supply, which is the supply. So what could cause the cost of a commodity to go up? Supply and inflation. And they're actually working in tandem now. But the real massive drive we've been seeing is supply. The supply globally is already being constrained by, as I've said elsewhere, peak oil and the E-ROI ratios being really bad. It's also tapped to the extreme because of supply access, because of the global supply chain breakup due to COVID. And now Europe specifically, it's very bad because Russia's turning off its gas to these countries at the same time that these countries are turning off their nuclear power plants. The United States has similar problems. And so you might say that in time of an emergency or commodity scarcity, regulation is necessary in order to prevent a famine effect, which could be justified if the famine effect is bad enough. So, for example, if you are in a tight spot and consuming a certain commodity at pre-emergency levels would lead to everybody running short and then suffering catastrophic failure, it might be justified in regulating that for the time being. A lot of people today would question any justification of that because they would say, well, will those controls ever come off? Because, as Ronald Reagan said, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government solution. So, yeah, good question. In theory, I think it could be justified, but then the question is, is it actually justifiable under the given conditions that we know? I think in part, regulation of energy consumption is a necessity. And it's a necessity ultimately because of not just peak oil, but peak everything. We've reached the peak extraction of all these energy resources, and they're just too hard to get anymore. And it's not that we run out. I mean, they're still in the ground. But the problem is they're thermodynamically infeasible to get them out of the ground because it'll take more energy to get them out than the energy you're going to get to replace it. So, yeah, that's another kind of regulation that could occur. And that regulation could either be justified if there actually is a real scarcity of a certain commodity that you need to basically ration it, tighten your belt, so to speak. But a lot of times that's, especially in the modern age, it's also associated with the idea of overreach, government overreach. They create the illusion of this so that they can roll out the regulation. And I think that's the underlying concern of J. Marshall J. is that, well, in the modern age, is there ever really any justification to regulate anything, given that the government is going to be the one doing the regulating, and can we really trust them? I think that that's the real question here, because I think we can make all sorts of thought experiments where it could, in theory, be justifiable in some cases to regulate certain behaviors and commodities, which, as standalone examples would make sense. But the real question is, do we have any reason to believe that the people in power making these regulations now are acting in good faith about any of these facts? No. The other problem is, since we are deep in the simulacrum, we lose all connectivity with cause and effect with those at the center of the power making this process. So then the other question is, even if they weren't completely, deranged and lunatic and evil, they would still have a very hard time of discerning cause and effect because of where they've situated themselves in this whole place. And in that case, it's like, well, okay, what do you do with that? It's hard, right? It's hard, and so I think that we need to make the distinction between an in principle justification for certain regulations in a saner situation, a saner world, and the one we live in now. And I think to get to the bottom of the sort of like implied question here, are these people who are advocating regulations dishonest and insincere? Yes, they are. And that's ultimately the problem that we're going to run up against. All right. I have a lot of comments here. What do we got? Let's see here. We've got Spinley. Hello. All right. Euthanasia. Can't this be blamed on post-World War II? Out of the old ways for war, it's time to rewrite the book on the new modern total war system. Yeah, sure. Putting us in a perpetual war footing, consuming at minimum level. Hello, I see we have Kevin Toohey. Hello, Kevin. Let's see. No, that's Kevin Toohey. No, that's not true at all. They only had violent communist revolutions when they hadn't developed capitalism fully. Oh, I see. He's responding to Euthanasia, who said, can't we have a revolution without the weapons? The U.S., Kevin Toohey, the U.S. could actually have a peaceful communist revolution. It would be a lot of worker strikes cutting off the throat of capitalism. Well, yeah, exactly. Like if you're able to organize labor and have a national strike all across the country, like what George Sorel wanted, you bring capitalism to its knees. But getting everybody on board to do that is a very tall task. Let's see. What do we got here? Euthanasia. Need power violence at some point to make it stick, I believe. Kevin Toohey, no, you don't need violence, or all you're going to get is a violent regime that follows. That's sort of what happened with Russia in 1917. Again, Toohey, you must avoid violence. You do not want violence, or you'll have another violent regime. Well, I mean, yeah, that seems to be what many modern leftists I've heard have said. At least old school ones that haven't gone woke. That's probably different now. Oh, Minoan, I lost track of time late. Well, at least you showed up. Let's see here. Minoan, I would like a seeking missile, but I'm settling for the homemade Gatling gun in my garage. Right. Minoan, many of the regulations today seem to be designed from a framework of health and safety. Yes. Yes, exactly. We've sort of turned health and safety into this like summum bonum, to use the medieval term, the highest good. And the reason why health and safety is the highest good today is because we live in an age that lacks spirituality. People believe life ends at death. And so death is the great evil to be warded off because everything stops. And so there's this desire to avoid death and live as long as possible, which is sort of a theme that's explored by Ursula K. Le Guin and The Farthest Shore from the Earthsea series, where a wizard named Cobb is trying to live forever, but in so doing, he's sucking the life out of all of Earthsea, which is sort of what people are doing now who try to live forever. They impose all these costs on the rest of us, imposed by the machines and the regulations and the externalities they do, and we're just sort of stuck. It's pretty bad. Minoan, the regulations to build a house are ridiculous. Yes, they are. In fact, that's probably why the story that I tell about my grandfather and his fire department friends wouldn't work today. They probably couldn't pass the housing code regulations. Let's see here. Euthanasia. I'm trying to start a barbecue business with a friend and regulations are killing me. Yeah, that's what they're meant to do, to shelter the already established institutions from competition. I forgot to bring that up. That's another thing regulations are for. Regulations, if they're done in a sort of economic sense, can be framed in order to restrict entry. So you can restrict entry of new businesses by raising all sorts of barriers to entry to those who are just getting started. So that's a common libertarian talking point. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So there's there's that. Don't get me started on healthcare. My head will explode. Again, yeah, lots of regulations. That's not great either. Okay, youth in Asia. We are in the era of post-merchant class. Yeah, it's more like technicians now. So regulating competition makes sense from their mindset. Yeah, it does, because it keeps them in power with minimal effort. They're sort of externalizing the cost onto the government to keep more profits for themselves. No, please, may I write the SOPs? It's my favorite thing to do. Let's see. A lot from euthanasia, I would say they don't care about civilians generally. Yep. Optic related to civilians, yes, but that's not the same. Not quite sure what you're getting at there. Plus, you have insurgencies, which would motivate a military threat to urban cities. As prices rise, it does become feasible and profitable to extract hard to get gas products. Well, but it becomes feasible financially, but it's not feasible energy wise. That's the real bottleneck here. It's not finance or money; it's energy exchange and transfers. The energy transfer is just not sustainable, no matter how much money you throw at it. And that's what I think the whole EROI thing is about. Regulation of energy means the death of modern economies. Well, I think the reason why they're regulating energy is because, well, one, they screwed up royally with Russia. That's one thing. But then the other thing is we are reaching peak everything. So these shortages are just going to happen anyhow. I think what they're trying to do is slow the realization of that by regulating it, by forcing people to consume less as these supplies run out. I think from their perspective, they're hoping to kick the can down the road. So looks like that's everyone here. Again, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to tune in again on Monday and Tuesday of next week, same time, 6 o'clock. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.